Washington, December 22, 1941. Winston Churchill disembarked from the aircraft onto American ground, his physique still bearing the strain from the 9-day Atlantic voyage that had conveyed him here under the cloak of utmost discretion. A mere 15 days had elapsed since the events at Pearl Harbor. 15 days since America had definitively entered the global conflict, a war Britain had endured alone for 2 years. The Prime Minister had journeyed to align strategic objectives with President Roosevelt, but what he was about to observe would profoundly test even his considerable oratorical prowess. Churchill had spent 2 years witnessing his island nation endure heavy losses. He possessed precise knowledge of Britain's production capabilities, having meticulously extracted every last tank, every last aerial craft, and every last vessel from manufacturing facilities that operated continuously, day and night, under the barrage of German ordnance. He understood the immense burden of waging modern warfare with circumscribed industrial capacity. He comprehended the necessity of rationing steel, of making difficult choices between prioritizing the construction of interceptors or bombers, of scrutinizing output charts, and recognizing that each numerical entry represented the absolute zenith of his people's achievable output. He had presumed to grasp the intricacies of industrial combat. He was on the cusp of realizing he had been competing in a lesser league. The initial indication arose not from a factory floor, but from a dialogue within the White House. Roosevelt's advisors presented their projected production figures for 1942. Churchill listened intently, his countenance impassive, as they detailed plans to construct 60,000 aircraft within a single year. 60,000. Britain, exerting every fiber of its being, had manufactured 20,000 in 1940. The Americans were proposing to amplify that output threefold, while concurrently developing a navy for 2 oceans and equipping an army numbering in the millions. Churchill's initial sentiment, documented in his personal memos, was one of doubt. He perceived these as American idealists, prone to undue optimism, unacquainted with the stark realities of contemporary war production logistics. Producing aircraft was not akin to assembling automobiles. One could not simply escalate production without consequence. There were inherent constraints, supply deficiencies, and technological limitations. He had encountered grandiose production forecasts previously. Then they facilitated his personal inspection of the endeavor. The Boeing facility in Seattle spanned vast expanses of floor area, a veritable sanctuary of aluminum and industrial enterprise. Churchill traversed the assembly line for the B-17 Flying Fortress, observing workers in a controlled frenzy swarming over airframes. The British produced bombers on an individual basis. Skilled artisans meticulously assembled intricate machinery with great care and exactitude. Here, Boeing was refining assembly line methodologies, segmenting the construction process into standardized phases, and instructing personnel to execute specific duties with maximum effectiveness. A supervisor elucidated the production timetable. They were presently completing 1 bomber each day. The objective was to reach 3 per day by mid-1942. Churchill performed a mental calculation. 3 bombers daily signified over 1,000 annually from this solitary plant. And Boeing possessed multiple operational sites. And Boeing was but one among numerous manufacturers. He remained silent for a considerable duration, observing a nearly finished B-17 progress along the line. Workers affixed panels, installed propulsion units, and fitted armament emplacements. The cacophony was immense, the scale overwhelming. They informed him this was merely the commencement, and that production would escalate throughout the year. Churchill turned to his aide and uttered words that, while unrecorded in official minutes, were recalled by those present. The statement was concise. "They are going to bury the Nazis in bombers." However, aerial vehicles constituted only the initial facet. It was within the shipyards that Churchill truly apprehended the immensity of American industrial might. Roosevelt escorted him to the Kaiser shipyards in California, where Henry Kaiser was revolutionizing shipbuilding techniques. Churchill was intimately familiar with ships. Britain had cultivated the world's preeminent navy through centuries of craftsmanship and heritage. Constructing a warship required years, each a singular creation, demanding specialized expertise and meticulous assembly. Even cargo vessels necessitated months of labor. Kaiser, however, was constructing Liberty ships in mere weeks. Churchill observed as a hull took form, not through conventional riveting, but by means of welding, a more expeditious methodology that Kaiser had perfected. The shipyard employed prefabrication, assembling entire ship sections in disparate locations before uniting them akin to components of a colossal jigsaw puzzle. Workers operated in multiple shifts around the clock. The yard glowed at night, resembling a miniature metropolis, with work ceaselessly in progress, the clamor of welding torches and cranes unceasing. They presented him with the statistics. The inaugural Liberty ship had required 244 days to construct. Kaiser had reduced this duration to 70 days, then to 42 days. The objective was 30 days. They informed him that one yard had recently completed a Liberty ship in just over 4 days as a promotional maneuver, though this pace was not sustainable for regular output. Churchill walked the length of a vessel under construction, his walking stick tapping against the metallic deck. These were not aesthetically pleasing vessels. They were utilitarian and unlovely, prioritizing function over form. But they would transport cargo, and in wartime, that was paramount. Britain was losing vessels to U-boats at a rate exceeding its replacement capacity. America was poised to construct ships at a velocity surpassing Germany's capacity for their destruction. "How many?" Churchill inquired. "How many of these vessels can you build?" The response was 2,700. Such was the program. 2,700 Liberty ships, in addition to hundreds of other craft, including tankers, warships, and landing vessels. The Kaiser shipyards alone intended to contribute 1/3 of all American merchant shipping tonnage during the war. Churchill had arrived in America seeking assistance. He was witnessing the mobilization of an entire continent. The automobile manufacturing plants revealed another dimension of American capability. In Detroit, Churchill toured facilities that, mere months prior, had produced Fords and Chevrolets. These were now being transformed for wartime production with astonishing rapidity. The identical assembly lines that had churned out passenger vehicles were being reconfigured to manufacture tanks, aircraft engines, and military trucks. The Ford Willow Run plant was still under construction at the time of Churchill's visit, but the blueprints were staggering. A single structure, exceeding 3 million square feet, designed for the mass production of B-24 Liberator bombers, employing automotive assembly techniques. The target was 1 bomber per hour. Churchill had observed British laborers toiling for weeks to complete a solitary bomber. Ford intended to produce them 60 times faster. At the Chrysler tank arsenal, Churchill ascended an M3 Grant tank, his hand tracing its armored exterior, peering into the turret. It did not possess the same caliber as the most advanced German tanks he was aware of, but it was being produced in vast quantities. The arsenal would churn out thousands of tanks annually. Britain's total tank output for 1941 had approximated 5,000 vehicles. This single American facility would match that annual production. A Chrysler executive articulated the production philosophy. They were not endeavoring to build the perfect tank. Rather, they were constructing adequately capable tanks in overwhelming numbers. They possessed the agility to refine, enhance, and modify designs more swiftly than the adversary could respond. Should a tank exhibit flaws, they would rectify them in subsequent production runs. The critical elements were volume and velocity. Churchill grasped the implication immediately. This was how America would prosecute the war, not through individual weapons superiority, although such advancements would materialize, but through overwhelming numerical advantage. They would inundate the Axis powers with an avalanche of steel, aluminum, and ordnance. The workforce perhaps represented the most remarkable facet. In Britain, Churchill had marshaled every available man, conscripting civilians, diverting workers from peacetime industries, pushing his limited population to its utmost limit. Britain, with its 47 million inhabitants, had seen millions enter military service or war-related employment. America, with its 135 million people, had scarcely begun its mobilization. The factories Churchill visited were rapidly filling with individuals who had been civilians only months before. Women were assuming roles on assembly lines, operating machinery, engaging in welding and riveting. The American labor pool was expanding at a rate that appeared inconceivable to British observers. A factory manager in California informed Churchill they had recruited 5,000 new employees within the preceding 3 months. 5,000. They were imparting training to individuals lacking any prior industrial experience, enabling them to perform complex manufacturing tasks within weeks. The scope of workforce mobilization paralleled the scale of industrial expansion. Churchill inquired about raw materials. Surely, he posited, America would encounter supply shortages as production accelerated. Steel, aluminum, rubber, copper, all the essential elements of modern warfare were finite. The Americans responded with smiles. They possessed resources that Britain could scarcely envision. Iron ore from Minnesota, bauxite for aluminum from Arkansas, copper from Montana, petroleum from Texas. Rubber presented a challenge, yes. The Japanese conquest of Southeast Asia had severed access to natural rubber supplies, prompting America to erect synthetic rubber production facilities. 25 such plants were planned, targeting an annual output exceeding 800,000 tons. When confronted with shortages, they innovated solutions. When increased production was required, they erected additional facilities. The American approach to wartime manufacturing was not to optimize existing capacity. Rather, it was to generate new capacity on a magnitude that rendered existing capacity inconsequential. Churchill returned to Washington and addressed a joint session of Congress on December 26th. His address, broadcast globally, featured carefully selected words intended to inspire both Americans and his countrymen in Britain. However, in private discussions with Roosevelt and his advisors, Churchill expressed himself more candidly regarding his observations. "I have witnessed the future," he informed them, "and it will consign fascism to oblivion." The production figures continued to escalate throughout 1942, coinciding with Churchill's subsequent visits and the receipt of regular reports. By the year's conclusion, American factories had manufactured 47,000 aircraft. While not reaching the initial target of 60,000, this figure vastly exceeded Churchill's perceived possibility. and production continued its upward trajectory. Tank production reached 25,000 vehicles in 1942. Ship production surpassed 8 million tons. The Liberty ship program, at its zenith, was delivering 3 vessels daily. The numbers were so substantial they approached abstraction, becoming difficult to comprehend in human terms. Churchill endeavored to explain this to his war cabinet in London. He presented them with the production statistics, the photographic evidence of American factories, and the charts projecting 1943 output. Some remained unconvinced. Surely, they suggested, the Americans were exaggerating. Surely, actual production would fall short of these extraordinary projections. However, the materiel began arriving in Britain, and skepticism dissipated. American tanks appeared within British armored divisions. American aircraft augmented RAF squadrons. American vessels conveyed supplies across the Atlantic in ever-increasing numbers. The statistics were not exaggerations. If anything, they were conservative. By 1943, American war production surpassed the combined output of Germany, Japan, and Italy. A single nation was outperforming 3 major industrial powers. The Ford Willow Run facility was completing a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Kaiser shipyards were launching a new Liberty ship each day. Chrysler's tank arsenal operated on 3 shifts around the clock. Churchill observed this transformation with a blend of relief and profound astonishment. Relief because he understood Britain could not have achieved victory alone. Astonishment because even his considerable imagination and historical knowledge had not fully encompassed the implications of American industrial mobilization. He had spent 2 years managing scarcity, making agonizing decisions regarding resource allocation, acutely aware that each choice meant some critical necessity would remain unmet. Now he was coordinating with a nation that approached war production with an entirely different philosophy. America did not choose between competing necessities. It expanded its production until it could satisfy all needs concurrently. The divergence became apparent during the planning for the invasion of France. British strategists approached the undertaking with meticulous calculations. How many landing craft could they construct? How many divisions could they outfit and transport? What represented the maximum force they could sustain across the English Channel? These numbers dictated what was feasible. American strategists approached it differently. What force was required for the invasion's success? Subsequently, they would construct the vessels, manufacture the materiel, and train the divisions to meet that specific requirement. The numbers defined the objective, not the limitation. Churchill had initially advocated for a smaller, more restricted invasion. The Americans favored Operation Overlord, a colossal assault employing overwhelming force. They envisioned thousands of ships, millions of tons of provisions, and dozens of divisions striking the beaches simultaneously. Churchill deemed it excessively ambitious, excessively hazardous, and overly reliant on resources they did not possess. However, they did possess the resources. The Americans were generating them. The landing craft alone numbered in the thousands. The provisions stockpiled in Britain filled warehouses across the nation. The divisions trained and equipped in America traversed the Atlantic in growing numbers. Churchill visited American troops stationed in Britain prior to D-Day, walking among individuals who had been civilians merely 2 years prior, now equipped with the finest weaponry American industry could provide. Every soldier was supplied with a rifle, ample ammunition, sturdy footwear, warm apparel, and wholesome sustenance. The contrast with British soldiers in 1940, improvising equipment from whatever was available, could not have been more stark. He conversed with an American tank crew, inquiring about their Sherman tank. It was dependable, they affirmed, simple to maintain. Not as heavily armored as German tanks, but they possessed a greater quantity of them. If one was lost, another would soon arrive. Their confidence stemmed not from superior equipment, but from superior numbers and logistical support. This was the nascent American mode of warfare that Churchill had witnessed taking shape. Unsurpassed material superiority, logistics wielded as a weapon, and production as a fundamental strategy. The figures for total American war production, compiled after the war's conclusion, were astonishing, even to those who had observed it firsthand. Over 300,000 aircraft of all classifications, 88,000 tanks, nearly 3,000 naval vessels, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, 64,000 landing craft, 2.6 million trucks. Yet Churchill grasped something that these statistics alone could not convey. He had seen American factories during their initial stages of conversion to wartime production. He had observed workers acquiring new proficiencies, managers resolving unprecedented challenges, and engineers devising solutions to bottlenecks. He had witnessed a nation discover its industrial strength, and then exert that strength beyond what anyone had deemed possible. The British had fought for their survival with valor and resolve, extracting every conceivable weapon from their limited resources. The Soviets had fought with immense sacrifice, relocating entire industrial complexes eastward, enduring staggering casualties while producing sufficient materiel to continue their resistance. But the Americans had fought with an abundance that effectively drowned the Axis powers in production, ensuring that Allied soldiers never lacked for equipment, supplies, or support. Churchill returned to London following his inaugural American visit and reported to the War Cabinet. His message was straightforward, yet profound. Britain would no longer fight alone. America was entering the war not solely with troops, vessels, and aircraft, but with an industrial capacity that would fundamentally alter the conflict's character. "Gentlemen," he informed them, "we have been engaged in a poor man's war, making do, improvising, stretching every resource to its utmost. The Americans are about to instruct us on how to fight a rich man's war." He was correct. American production not only furnished the materiel necessary to achieve victory, but also reshaped the very strategy by which the war was waged. The Allies could afford a degree of extravagance, accept losses, and initiate large-scale operations, secure in the knowledge that any losses could be readily replaced. They could bomb Germany continuously because they possessed an ample supply of bombers. They could engage in multiple theaters of operation concurrently, due to their sufficient fleet of ships and provisions. They could equip not only American forces, but also British, Soviet, and other Allied contingents, as production exceeded all their combined requisites. The Germans and Japanese had anticipated a swift conflict, a war of superior skill and tactics compensating for material disadvantages. They had not prepared for a protracted war of attrition against an adversary capable of producing armaments at a rate faster than they could destroy them. Such was the nature of the war that American industry orchestrated. Churchill had perceived its advent. In December of 1941, while traversing Boeing plants and Kaiser shipyards, witnessing the nascent stages of a mobilization that would mature into a tidal wave of production, he had immediately comprehended its significance, even if he struggled to fully accept the magnitude it would ultimately attain. In his war memoirs, penned years later, Churchill reflected on that initial American visit. He chronicled Roosevelt's unwavering resolve, the warmth of the American reception, and the crucial importance of coordinating strategy. But he also detailed the factories, the assembly lines, the workers, and the sheer, overwhelming immensity of American industrial power. "I had studied the American Civil War," he wrote, "and I knew what American industry could achieve when fully mobilized. But knowing it intellectually and observing it with one's own eyes are entirely different matters." He had arrived in America seeking an ally. He had discovered an arsenal that would bury the Axis under an avalanche of steel, aluminum, and explosives. He had found the weapon that would secure victory. The production statistics narrated the tale in stark numerical terms. However, Churchill had perceived something that the numbers alone could not encapsulate. He had witnessed a nation discovering its inherent strength, transforming its economy, mobilizing its populace, and establishing a military-industrial capacity on a scale unprecedented in global history. He had glimpsed the future of warfare, a future dominated by the nation possessing the capacity to produce the most, the fastest, and for the longest duration. Germany had placed its faith in blitzkrieg, swift conquests before industrial capacity became a decisive factor. Japan had gambled on controlling vital resources and establishing a defensive perimeter. Both had miscalculated catastrophically. They had entered into conflict with a nation possessing the industrial wherewithal to sustain a protracted war of attrition. And in such a war, production was destiny. Churchill had witnessed that destiny taking shape within American factories in December of 1941. He had observed its unfolding over the subsequent years as American output escalated from impressive to overwhelming, and finally to simply incomprehensible. And when the war concluded with Allied triumph, he recognized that victory had been forged as much within the factories of Detroit, the shipyards of Seattle, and the coastal yards of California as it had on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. The Americans had achieved victory in the manner they approached all endeavors, with scale, speed, and an almost nonchalant assurance that any obstacle could be surmounted by building more, building faster, and building better. Churchill hailed from a nation characterized by limited resources and meticulous planning. He had observed a nation that approached wartime production, indeed all its undertakings, with the implicit assumption that limitations were merely challenges awaiting resolution. What did Churchill articulate upon witnessing America's war machine up close? The official record contains diplomatic accolades and carefully worded political pronouncements. But those who were present, who traversed the factory floors alongside him, who witnessed the expression on his face as he watched B-17s emerge from assembly lines and Liberty ships slide into the water, recalled something far simpler. He had stood in silent contemplation for a considerable duration, observing the tangible manifestation of American industrial might. And then he had smiled. It was not the public smile of a statesman, but the private smile of a man who had carried the burden of Britain's survival for 2 years and suddenly possessed the absolute certainty that his nation would prevail. "We are going to win," he had stated quietly. not as a hopeful aspiration or a fervent prayer, but as an established fact. American production had rendered victory an inevitability. It was merely a question of temporal progression, and he had been unequivocally correct.